Once upon a time, a very, very long time ago, people did not live in houses or cities as we do. They lived in small groups, moving from place to place. We call them hunter-gatherers. Their whole life was spent searching for food. The men would hunt for big animals like mammoths or deer, which was a dangerous job. The women and children would gather berries, nuts and roots from the plants they found. They had to know which plants were good to eat and which were poisonous. They lived in caves or simple huts made of branches and animal skins, always ready to move when the animals they hunted moved on, or when the seasons changed. Life was hard and uncertain. Sometimes they found plenty of food, and everyone was happy. But other times the hunt was not successful, or the plants did not grow, and they would go hungry. They had to be very clever and brave to survive. They learned to make tools from stone, wood, and bone. These tools helped them to hunt, to cut meat, and to prepare skins for clothing. They also learned to control fire, which was a wonderful discovery. Fire kept them warm, scared away dangerous animals, and allowed them to cook their food, which made it easier to eat and digest. Then, something extraordinary happened. It was a change so big that it changed everything for humankind, forever. In different parts of the world, perhaps in a place called Mesopotamia, people made a brilliant discovery. They noticed that if they dropped seeds on the ground, new plants would grow from them. Instead of just gathering the grains they found, they could plant them and grow their own food. This was the beginning of farming, or what we call agriculture. They learned to grow wheat and barley, and they also learned to tame animals like sheep, goats, and cows. Now they had a steady supply of food right where they lived. This shift from hunting and gathering to farming was a true revolution. People no longer had to wander around all the time. They could build stronger, more permanent homes and stay in one place. They began to live together in larger groups, forming the very first villages. They had more food than they needed just for themselves, so they could store it for the winter or for times when crops failed. This extra food meant that not everyone had to be a farmer. Some people could become skilled at making pots, weaving cloth, or building houses. Life became a little safer, a little more predictable, and much more organized. Once people started farming and living in villages, their world began to grow. These small villages slowly turned into bustling towns and then into the world's very first cities. This happened in places where the land was very fertile, especially in the valleys of great rivers. One such place was Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Here, people learned to build canals to bring water from the rivers to their fields, a clever trick called irrigation. This allowed them to grow even more food, and their cities, like Ur and Babylon, grew large and powerful. Life in a city was very different from life in a small village. With so many people living together, they needed rules to keep order. They needed leaders to make decisions and to protect them from enemies. This was how the first governments were born, led by powerful priests and kings. These rulers claimed to have been chosen by the gods to rule over the people. They collected taxes, which was a share of the food everyone grew, to feed soldiers and pay for big building projects. They built enormous temples called ziggurats to honor their gods and grand palaces for themselves. These were the first states where power was held by a small group of people at the top. To keep track of all the grain in the storehouses and all the taxes collected, the people of Mesopotamia invented something truly amazing: writing. At first it was just simple pictures to represent objects. But over time these pictures turned into wedge-shaped marks made on clay tablets. We call this cuneiform. Writing was a powerful tool. It allowed people to record laws, tell stories, and send messages over long distances. Around the same time, great civilizations were also rising along other rivers. In Egypt, along the Nile River, pharaohs built giant pyramids as tombs. In the Indus Valley, in modern-day Pakistan and India, cities like Mohenjo-Daro had advanced plumbing systems. And in China, along the Yellow River, the Shang dynasty began a long history of powerful ruling families. Each of these early civilizations had its own unique culture, gods, and way of life. But they all shared some important things. They all depended on farming and the power of the state. They all built impressive cities and monuments that still fill us with wonder today. They traded with one another, exchanging goods like wood, metal, and precious stones. This trade helped spread new ideas and technologies from one land to another. These first civilizations laid the foundations for the world we know, creating the very ideas of government, law, writing, and organized religion that would shape human history for thousands of years to come. After the first great civilizations, new powers rose and fell, but some left a mark on the world that would never fade. In a sunny rocky land by the sea, the ancient Greeks built a world of ideas. They were not one big kingdom, but a collection of small city-states like Athens and Sparta. In Athens, they tried a new way of governing themselves which they called democracy, meaning rule by the people. Not everyone could vote, of course, only the men who were citizens, but it was a revolutionary idea that people could have a say in how they were ruled. The Greeks loved to ask big questions about the world. What is truth? What is justice? What is the best way to live? Their thinkers, called philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, tried to answer these questions using reason and logic instead of just relying on old stories about the gods. They studied mathematics and discovered rules about shapes and numbers. They watched the stars and tried to understand the movement of the planets. They wrote thrilling plays, both funny and sad, which were performed in open-air theaters and are still performed today. They also loved sports and held the Olympic Games to honor their gods and celebrate human strength and skill. The ideas of the Greeks about government, science, and art were so powerful that they spread far and wide. While the Greeks were thinking great thoughts, a new power was growing in Italy. It started as a small city called Rome. The Romans were not thinkers like the Greeks at first. They were practical people. They were brilliant soldiers, organizers, and builders. They built a mighty army that conquered all the lands around the Mediterranean Sea, creating a huge empire that stretched from Britain to Egypt. To rule this vast territory, they created a system of laws that was so fair and logical that many countries still use Roman ideas in their own legal systems today. The Roman motto was Senatus Populusque Romanus, or SPQR, meaning the Senate and people of Rome. The Romans were master engineers. They built long, straight roads that connected every part of their empire, making it easier for their armies to march and for traders to travel. They built incredible aqueducts, which were like long bridges for water to bring fresh water from the mountains into their cities. Their cities had public baths, libraries, and enormous arenas like the Colosseum, where people could watch gladiator fights. For a long time, the empire enjoyed a period of peace and prosperity known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. During this time, trade flourished, and ideas, including the new religion of Christianity, spread easily along the Roman roads. While Rome was ruling the West, great empires were also thriving in other parts of the world. In Persia, the Achaemenid Empire was a vast and well-organized state that stretched from India to Greece. They were famous for their efficient postal system and their policy of religious tolerance. In India, the Mauryan and Gupta empires made incredible advances. During the Gupta period, often called a golden age, Indian mathematicians invented the number system we use today, including the brilliant concept of zero. They were also masters of medicine and astronomy, and great works of literature and art were created. Their ideas and goods traveled along trade routes to other lands. In China, the Han Dynasty created a strong, unified empire that lasted for over 400 years. Like the Romans, they built a vast network of roads and canals. They created a strong government run by educated officials who had to pass difficult exams. To get a job as a government official, you had to prove you were smart, not just that you were from a rich family. The Han also invented many useful things, including paper, the compass, and the seismograph to detect earthquakes. The famous Silk Road, a network of trade routes, connected China with the Roman Empire, allowing precious silk to travel west and other goods like wool and glass to travel east. This was also an age when great new religions and belief systems spread across the world, changing the way millions of people saw their place in the universe. In India, Buddhism emerged, teaching that people could find peace by ending their desires. Buddhist missionaries traveled along the trade routes carrying their message to China, Japan, and Southeast Asia. In the Middle East, the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth grew into Christianity, which spread throughout the Roman Empire despite early persecution. Later in the 7th century, the religion of Islam was founded by the Prophet Muhammad in Arabia, and it spread with astonishing speed across the Middle East, North Africa, and into Spain. These new beliefs gave people a sense of shared identity that was often stronger than belonging to a kingdom or an empire. They provided moral guidance, comfort in times of trouble, and answers to life's biggest questions. Great empires like the Islamic Caliphates and the Tang dynasty in China became centers of learning and culture, preserving ancient Greek and Roman knowledge, and making new discoveries in science, mathematics, and medicine. Trade routes were not just for goods anymore, they became highways for faith and ideas, connecting distant civilizations and weaving a more complex human story across the globe. After the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, Europe entered a period we call the Middle Ages. But then, starting in Italy around the 14th century, a new spirit of excitement and curiosity began to bubble up. People started to look back at the old art and books of the ancient Greeks and Romans with fresh eyes. They were amazed by the beauty and wisdom they found. This period of rebirth of old ideas is called the Renaissance. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo created breathtaking paintings and sculptures that looked more realistic and full of life than anything that had been made for centuries. This new way of thinking was not just about art. Scholars known as humanists believed that humans were capable of great things and that life on Earth was something to be celebrated and understood. The invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440 was a monumental change. Before, books had to be copied by hand, which took a very long time and made them very expensive. Now, books could be printed quickly and cheaply. Ideas could spread like wildfire. More people learned to read, and new knowledge about science, medicine, and the world was suddenly available to a much wider audience than ever before. At the same time, people began to question the authority of the powerful Catholic Church. A German monk named Martin Luther was unhappy with some of the church's practices. In 1517 he wrote a list of his complaints called the 95 Theses and nailed it to a church door. He argued that people could find their own way to God through faith and by reading the Bible for themselves. This sparked a movement called the Reformation, which split the Christian church in Europe into Catholics and Protestants. This led to many years of religious wars, but it also encouraged people to think for themselves about their beliefs. Fueled by this new curiosity and a desire for the rich spices and silks of the East, European explorers set out on dangerous voyages across unknown oceans. They were helped by new inventions like the compass and better ship designs. Christopher Columbus sailed west and reached the Americas in 1492, thinking he had found a new route to India. Vasco da Gama sailed around Africa to reach India directly. For the first time in history, all the continents of the world were connected by sea routes. This led to a huge exchange of plants, animals, diseases and ideas between the Old World, Europe, Asia and Africa, and the New World, the Americas, an event we call the Columbian Exchange. The connections made by explorers started a new era, but it was not always a happy one. European powers grew rich and powerful from the gold, silver and other resources they took from the Americas, Africa and Asia. They built vast colonial empires ruling over people in distant lands. This new global trade made some nations incredibly wealthy, but it often brought great suffering to the people they colonized. At the same time, new ways of thinking about science and government were taking hold in Europe. Scientists like Nicholas Copernicus and Galileo Galilei showed that the Earth revolved around the sun, challenging old beliefs about the universe. This was the scientific revolution. These new scientific ideas encouraged people to use reason to understand not just nature, but society as well. Thinkers of the Enlightenment, as this period was called, argued that all people had certain natural rights, like the right to life, liberty, and property. They questioned the idea that kings had a divine right to rule. An English thinker named John Locke said that governments should have the consent of the people they govern. These were radical, dangerous ideas, and they would soon inspire people to fight for their freedom and change their governments by force. The first great explosion happened in the American colonies. Unhappy with being taxed by the British king without having any say in the matter, the colonists declared their independence in 1776. They fought a war and created a new nation, the United States of America, based on Enlightenment ideas of liberty and democracy. A few years later, in 1789, the people of France rose up against their king and nobles. The French Revolution was a violent and chaotic struggle for liberty, equality, and fraternity. It overthrew a powerful monarchy and shook every other kingdom in Europe to its core. Following these revolutions, another huge change began to sweep across the world, starting in Britain. This was the Industrial Revolution. New machines powered by steam engines were invented, which could make cloth and other goods much faster than people could by hand. Huge factories were built in cities, and people flocked from the countryside to work in them. This new industrial power changed everything. It created enormous wealth for factory owners, but the workers, including children, often faced long hours, low pay, and dangerous conditions. The world was becoming more connected and more productive, but also more unequal and full of new conflicts. The 20th century began with a sense of optimism, but it would become the most violent and destructive century in human history. The great empires of Europe were competing fiercely for colonies, resources, and power. They built up huge armies and navies and made secret alliances with one another. This created a tense and dangerous situation, like a giant powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark came in 1914, when a Serbian nationalist assassinated the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. Because of the web of alliances, one country after another was dragged into the conflict, which became known as the First World War. It was a new kind of war, a total war. Millions of soldiers fought from muddy, miserable trenches facing machine guns, poison gas, and giant artillery shells. Entire nations turned their economies to the war effort. The war lasted for 4 terrible years and left millions dead and entire landscapes destroyed. It brought about the collapse of the German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires. In Russia, the war led to a revolution in 1917 which brought the communists led by Vladimir Lenin to power. They created a new kind of state, the Soviet Union, based on the ideas of Karl Marx, where the government controlled all property and industry. After the war, people hoped for a lasting peace. But the peace treaty was harsh on Germany, and the economic problems of the 1930s, known as the Great Depression, created hardship and anger around the world. In this climate of fear and uncertainty, new aggressive leaders came to power. In Italy, Benito Mussolini created a fascist government. In Germany, Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party promised to restore Germany's greatness. They promoted extreme nationalism, racism, and hated democracy. In Japan, military leaders also grew more powerful, seeking to build an empire in Asia. These new ideologies were completely opposed to the ideas of liberty and human rights. In 1939, Hitler's Germany invaded Poland, and the world was plunged into war once again. The Second World War was even more global and more destructive than the first. It was fought across Europe, North Africa, Asia, and the Pacific Ocean. The fighting involved horrific new weapons and tactics, including the bombing of entire cities. The war also witnessed one of the darkest chapters in human history, the Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others by the Nazis. The war finally ended in 1945 after the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan, unleashing a terrifying new form of power on the world. When the smoke of the Second World War cleared, the world was a very different place. The old European empires were shattered and exhausted. 2 new superpowers had emerged, with very different ideas about how the world should be run. The United States, which championed democracy and capitalism, and the Soviet Union, which promoted communism. The former allies became rivals in a long, tense standoff known as the Cold War. It was called a Cold War because the 2 superpowers never fought each other directly. But they competed for influence all over the globe, supporting opposite sides in conflicts in places like Korea and Vietnam. This period was also incredibly dangerous because both sides had developed thousands of nuclear weapons. The fear of a nuclear war that could destroy the entire planet hung over the world for decades. A metaphorical Iron Curtain fell across Europe, dividing the continent into the democratic West and the communist East. In Germany, the city of Berlin was split in 2 by a wall, a stark symbol of this global division. Countries around the world were forced to choose sides, joining alliances like NATO in the West or the Warsaw Pact in the East. It was a time of suspicion, spying, and a constant arms race. At the same time, another great change was sweeping the globe: decolonization. The people of Africa and Asia, who had been ruled by European powers for centuries, demanded their freedom. Inspired by leaders like Mahatma Gandhi in India, who used non-violent resistance to challenge British rule, independence movements grew stronger. One by one, new nations were born. From India and Pakistan in 1947 to Ghana in 1957, and dozens more in the years that followed. This was a tremendous victory for the idea of self-determination, but it was often a difficult process, leading to new conflicts over borders and power within the newly independent countries. Alongside these political struggles, the world was also being reconnected in new ways. The post-war years saw a boom in technology and culture. Television brought images of world events into people's living rooms. Jet airplanes made international travel faster and more accessible. Popular music like rock and roll spread across the globe, creating a shared youth culture. While the world was politically divided, these cultural and technological links were quietly weaving people together, creating the first hints of the truly globalized world that was to come. The Cold War would eventually end with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, but these other connections would only grow stronger. The end of the Cold War in the early 1990s felt like a new beginning. It seemed that the big conflicts of the 20th century were over, and that a future of peace and cooperation was at hand. This new era has been defined by globalization, the idea that people, money, and ideas can move around the world more freely and quickly than ever before. This was supercharged by a revolutionary new technology, the Internet. The Internet connected computers all over the world, allowing people to communicate instantly, share vast amounts of information, and do business across borders. Our world has become a single, interconnected community in ways that would have been unimaginable to our ancestors. This interconnected world has brought many benefits. Global trade has lifted millions of people out of poverty, especially in countries like China and India, which have become major economic powers. We have access to goods, food, and entertainment from every corner of the planet. We can learn about different cultures and talk to people on the other side of the world with the click of a button. Advances in medicine and science continue to help us live longer, healthier lives. There is a greater global awareness of human rights, and many people and organizations work to protect the dignity and freedom of individuals everywhere. However, our interconnected world also faces great challenges. Globalization has not benefited everyone equally, and the gap between the rich and the poor remains a huge problem. We face new kinds of conflicts, including terrorism that can strike anywhere, and disagreements between nations over trade and influence. One of the biggest challenges of all is climate change. The burning of fossil fuels like coal and oil, which powered the Industrial Revolution and our modern economies, is warming the planet, leading to more extreme weather, rising sea levels, and a threat to the very environment that sustains us. So where does our long human story go from here? The journey from the first farmers to our digital age shows us that humans are incredibly creative and resilient. We have overcome immense challenges in the past by inventing new tools, creating new ideas, and learning to cooperate. The challenges we face today, like climate change, pandemics, and ensuring a fair world for everyone, are global. They affect every single one of us. To solve them, we will need to use our cleverness and our ability to work together on a scale never seen before. The next chapter of world history is still unwritten, and it is up to all of us to help write it.
Ready for a history adventure? Join our community. Subscribe to World History, smash that like, share with friends, and drop your thoughts below. Let's make history together. See you in the comments.